Welcome to the Wolfe Power Club, the weekly podcast where we discuss energy, industry and politics. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Wolfe Power Club podcast special for International Energy Week. And I am delighted that in International Energy Week, we have one of the keynote speakers. And as the podcast has always said, we want to get you into that virtual boardroom with the CEOs that are changing the landscape of the energy industry. So today, I'm very, very happy to announce that from ETFuels, we have their CEO, Lara, to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Lara.
Thank you very much, Alex. Delighted to be here.
So we're going to jump straight into it because our listeners like no hanging about. And I think it's fair to say your LinkedIn has one of the greatest one-liners I've ever seen in the industry. It says energy transition at hyperscale. What does that mean? Because it sounds brilliant and we're all on board for it.
Well, fantastic. Exactly. We can figure out what it means. But as you say, it's definitely something we're all on board for. I mean, I guess, what does it actually mean? So there's a couple of ways of coming at this. One is, I guess, my co-founders and I started ETFuels 3 years ago, and the three of us had spent a lot of time working on various forms of decarbonisation project. I used to be the head of sustainability for Google in the UK. The two of them had worked at a management consulting firm very much focused on the energy transition. And I guess everything that we did, we felt that there was just this we felt a deep sense of frustration around how slowly things were happening and how everyone wanted to focus on pilots and measurement and data and not actually just get on with it. So energy transition at hyperscale is supposed to be around the energy transition needs to happen today and needs to happen big. But what does that actually mean in practice? One of the things that we're trying to do is to figure out how do you actually make that happen? And really you make that happen, I think, by, in our view, really figuring out how do you unleash the full power of renewable energy. Renewable energy being, of course, a key enabler of energy transition. And today, the biggest challenge in getting the energy transition to happen is how do you make that renewable energy available at scale in a cheap and low-cost way? And that's what we're trying to do with ETFuels.
I think that's what's exciting when you talk about at scale, because there's nothing more, a bit like yourself, in various different roles. I've had 2 decades of going to some of the most prestigious energy lectures or meetings, and someone talks about this great tech, and then at the end of the meeting, they're like, we could do 5 vehicles or 20 vehicles, and you're a bit like, yeah, that's not what we're looking for here. And I also remember when I was one of the largest suppliers of fuel, people come with these most brilliant products but hadn't been improved by engine manufacturers. No one could get their warranties covered, and there's all that sort of stuff that meant that, like as you said, mass scale was so far off for that product that it really created problems. So it leads nicely into probably one of the big challenges for mankind, and is the global maritime industry. A lot of people might think about it as just the leisure side, but obviously an island like the UK, as an example, so much of our stuff is imported by the maritime industry, and it has one of the biggest challenges on emissions, and mainly because to move something from continents through maritime shipping has extremely high energy intensity. And I know this is something that you've been sort of focusing on and specializing in. So how do we get maritime closer to net zero?
Yeah. Well, ultimately, whether it's maritime, aviation, these sort of hard to abate transport sectors, of course, you can play around the edges with energy efficiency, but the only way to really decarbonize is to change the fuel type, moving away from fossil fuels to green fuels of some kind. So that's sort of step one, right? The question then becomes, well, what type of green fuels? And you really have 2 options. You can either go the biofuels route, cheap, available today, work in ships, or you can go the e-fuels route. And I guess the challenge that we've seen is near term, biofuels very attractive, but just not scalable. E-fuels are really the only way you can decarbonize, whether it's marine or aviation, at scale. So as a starting point, that's kind of the premise, right? I guess the reason we chose to start with marine, well, there were maybe two or three reasons. The first is there are e-fuels that are technologically possible to make today that can be used in engines today. And in fact, one of them, e-methanol, is, well, methanol as a chemical compound is the fourth most commonly used marine fuel globally. So we felt that, okay, people are using grey methanol, they can absolutely switch to e-methanol. 300 ships have already been ordered by the shipping industry to take methanol. So it's a technically viable solution. The second reason, though, that we wanted to target the marine sector was because actually there is already legislation in place that makes it commercially attractive for companies to switch. Now, that legislation doesn't really start to bite until 2030, but that timing actually works quite well for developers such as ourselves who need sort of 5 years, 6 years, depending where you are in your life cycle, to bring this fuel to market. So I guess to sort of tackle that kind of question that you asked, there are readily available solutions today. The legislation actually incentivizes them. And from a technology perspective, you can make them with relatively low tech risk. And that's what we're trying to do.
I think where you're also knocking on a good door there is that I also found the port community, which a lot will be at International Energy Week, are actually quite progressive in that I did find that sort of previously in my career when we launched one of the early HVO truck sites at Southampton, the Southampton port was very focused across different stakeholders from owners to landlords to big users there of actually they wanted to come sustainable very quickly, and I actually think that maritime is a good place to start because I do feel that, as I say, if you find the right sort of set of links, you've got a very connected global community. So although it covers thousands of miles, it is a community that actually I think will get onto it pretty well. But I think you've come from very different backgrounds. A lot of people I have on this podcast sort of died in the wall sort of engineers from the start and then ended up in leadership positions. Your background fascinates me, and I was just wondering if you could share a bit how it prepared you for ETFuels, because if I understand correctly, you've both done the sort of big industry side, energy side with the likes of Rio Tinto, but you've also done the big tech side with Google. And it's fair to say that we don't have many sort of keynote speakers that always come from the tech world as well as the industry world. So you can talk to us a bit about how that prepared you for these challenges and how the two sort of skill sets might meet in a perfect Venn diagram at ETFuels.
They do actually, and I'll get to that. But I mean, so what's the actual common thread in my career? It's really been finance. So, I started as a banker, I moved into private equity. I then worked for a carbon trading fund, basically doing project finance. At Rio, again, I was the CFO of our commercial business. And then even at Google, I joined Google as the CFO of Google UK and then pivoted into the sustainability and running a P&L. So as much as it sounds like this crazy, eclectic career, at the end of the day, I'm an accountant. Let's just call a spade a spade. Maybe 2 points though. So I think one is I've always been very, very focused. I've been a risk averse, very focused on a business case. And ultimately, with trying to get people to switch, do something they haven't done before, there needs to be a business case because you're asking people to take risks they haven't taken before. So there needs to be a financially compelling reason for them to do that. And obviously being able to speak that language, whether it be to the CFOs of our customers or whether that be to the investment community, has been somewhat helpful. I think, though, one of the things that I have really reflected on as I've taken on this role, which is a very different role from anything I've done before, is that to bring these kinds of projects to life, you really need two things. One is you need the discipline, the operational effectiveness, the focus on safety, the project management skills of a big oil and gas, a big mining company. These are multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects. And I've spent most of my life working on those kinds of projects. But at the same time, you need to be able to bring those projects to life in an agile way because they're innovative, they're entrepreneurial. I mean, look, I love Rio Tinto, and it was a place I spent just under a decade. We used to have a committee to reduce the number of committees, right? And so, if we just take the Rio mindset, I mean, do you see where I'm going with it? If we just take the Rio mindset, I mean, energy transition at hyperscale by the time my grandchildren are like, having grandchildren. So Google, on the other hand, I mean, you know, probably one of the most innovative, probably one of the most innovative companies in the world. And really, that was formed by a culture that enabled innovation and that cultivated risk taking, which sounds very cliched, but there are a number of things that Google would do to actually de-risk risk taking and enable people to move in an aligned way, but very entrepreneurially in an agile, fast manner. Because of course, in the tech space, you don't have time to have a committee to reduce the number of committees. Your competitors are moving twice as fast as you are, and so what I guess we're trying to do with ETFuels is combine that discipline, but with decision making and speed of movement that is more entrepreneurial.
That's a great answer because I think a lot of people uh, might not understand, but I myself was SEMA certified, not quite chartered, but essentially I would say to anyone wanting to get into energy, actually doing a period in finance or some qualifications in finance. And I started off in Shell's finance team, working for the then CIO and CFO. I think it's a great for anyone to
Yeah.
understand because, as you said, ultimately decisions are going to be made by a metric that involves financial discipline. But I think this is what quite interests me now in the sector you're in, because I would say that the past few decades have been kind of really tough for sustainable ideas to have a structured financial approach. Quite often it's grants, and suddenly an election might totally throw those
Yeah.
grants out the window. Or, as we've seen, I think globally, things like whether it's COVID suddenly taking away funds that the government had earmarked for, say, sustainable development to suddenly immediate emergency, and they've got less tax receipts coming in. I think we see it across the industry. So I'm interested with that CFO mindset. How do we make stakeholders come long-term investors in sustainable projects and this hyperscale of bringing sustainable solutions into the market?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, maybe a couple of ways to break that down. I think the first is on regulation. I mean, people ask me, oh, are you worried about all this regulation going away because people, I mean, people are no longer going to be focused on sustainability. I mean, let's be very clear, right? The entire global ecosystem, including the fossil fuel industry, is entirely dependent on regulation, right? So the idea that regulation is the only, is specific to green energy is just wrong, right? So, and even if I think about something like the US, where there's a whole bunch of regulatory incentives behind renewables, behind green hydrogen, so on and so forth, it's very nuanced. And those same regulatory drivers that help us as a green fuels developer are also things that help the oil and gas industry. And so regulation is a moving target, right? But ultimately, it's an enabler of everything, right? And so I guess it is what it is, and investment decisions have to be made in a world where regulation is always going to change, whether it's green or dirty, right? So it is what it is, and on balance, you've got to make a decision weighing up all the risks and rewards, right? So I guess I'd say that. I think though, in terms of how do you get investors to take long-term bets, right? For these nascent markets, ultimately contract structures need to be long-term as well. And so when we're thinking about selling our product or even contracting our feedstock, we are really talking about long-term contracts. The way that we de-risk though is I like to talk about how we're in a different world from a security of supply perspective. And that goes all the way down the value chain. So what I mean by that is if you're a shipping company and you're trying to buy fuel, you're used to buying that on the spot markets today. Fuel oil is a commodity. Go and get that whenever you want. Don't take any price risk exposure. In a world where suddenly you absolutely need green fuel or you're going to pay super penalties and that green fuel is scarce, you need a different procurement strategy. And actually, there's advantages to actually locking in that fuel for a longer period of time. That means the developer can then get their long-term contract, and that means that the investor has comfort that there's going to be a long-term revenue line for that business. I think the other thing, sort of, to look at it from a sort of more macro perspective is we've seen this with renewables, is that when you kickstart an industry with regulatory support, the cost savings you see as more and more capacity gets built out are immense. And, the decimation we've seen in solar and wind costs over time, kick-started by regulation, but now, on cost parity with conventional sources, it's going to be exactly what we're going to see in the green fuel space. So I don't think we need regulation to support these kinds of mechanisms forever, because ultimately, the wind and the sun are always going to be cheaper than fossil fuels. It's just about how do you get down that cost curve. And then on top of that, of course, the narrative we're seeing that's quite different in the US now, but I mean more broadly across Europe as well, is let's move this away from a green discussion to a security of supply discussion. And there, very different drivers behind both governments and therefore investors in terms of, what these kinds of fuels mean from a security of supply perspective.
I think that's great for our listeners. And if you want a real life example of that, I remember in 2022, as you said, when we procured the product of AdBlue, which most engines that are Euro 6 diesel taking now, we were happily supplying. As you said, we'd go into contract rounds, see who had the best prices. Suddenly, when the Ukraine conflict started, it didn't really get any headlines, this, because it wasn't main fuel prices. It wasn't, but the reality is, because the price of gas went so high, it meant the price of the electrolysis process to actually make AdBlue meant that a lot of factories in Central Europe just mothballed. It was cheaper for them not to make it than for them to carry on making it their contracted prices. And suddenly we had a real supply issue across Europe, and it wasn't just myself that was battling. I had my peers across, and we were meeting the guys in Brussels and stuff like that, and we were really just desperate to get supply. And suddenly we also had contracts backed off at fixed rates and Platts rates that we just couldn't do, and it was kind of a force majeure through supply security. And I do urge anyone, whether they are looking at long-term policy decisions, supply security is a big thing, and it's not just some sort of myth created by people wanting long contracts. It's genuinely needed for security. And I was just wondering if you've seen any of that stuff in your career that sort of made you realize that why you came to that position of supply security being so important.
Yeah, well, I mean, I saw the same trends as you in terms of Russia, Ukraine, and a whole different narrative on energy, right? But I've also worked, obviously, as we talked about, in mining for many years, and securing supply of critical minerals and long-term contract structures for those minerals has been quite a normal commercial outcome, right? So would certainly say the same thing there. I mean, the third thing we're saying, and look, I don't want to stray into the world of politics and all that stuff. Definitely
Tell me
not
about
my wheelhouse.
it.
But jobs, right? I mean, green industry is jobs, and increasingly, as you look at the policies that are coming out, it's not just about whacking people on the head for polluting. It's also about how do I retain, that green industry in Europe or in the US, and what incentives do I need to put in place to ensure that, quite frankly, China doesn't steal all the jobs, right? If we're going to be completely cliched about it. And so that also helps sort of the stuff that we're doing as well.
That's really, really exciting. So it leads nicely then into, I know something that ETFuels is passionate about is off-grid solutions. We have had a mixture on this podcast over the last few seasons. We've had like the main grid experts, and we've had a lot of off-grid technologies. I'm interested why you think there is opportunities in off-grid solutions, and we've also got National Grid coming on in the episodes, and I was just wondering, is grid connections challenges or bottlenecks a huge opportunity for you guys with off-grid solutions, and what does off-grid mean in an ETFuels world?
Yeah. Um, so maybe to give you a bit of background behind the thinking, right? So when you're looking at e-fuels, roughly 70% of the cost of making an e-fuel is the power cost, the cost of the renewable power. And when you look at the cost of renewable power, the reason it's expensive is not because solar or wind turbines are expensive. It's really because getting onto that grid is hard. Getting a grid connection, I mean, electricity grids were not built for the kinds of usage that we see today. And I'm sure your national grid uh, um, um, person will tell you the same thing. And so the challenge with the grid is multiple, right? One is it takes ages to get onto the grid. The second is when you get on the grid, you've got to pay, depending on where you are, a $40 to $50 per megawatt hour transmission fee just to use that grid. And then the third is if you're an e-fuels developer and you're trying to buy renewable power from the grid, you're competing with my old employer, Microsoft, Facebook. Good luck for ETFuels to compete with Google for electricity. The demand supply dynamics on the grid are not favorable for e-fuels producers. So our concept was basically to say, rather than pay, 80 to $100 per megawatt hour for power, if we're off grid, we can basically make our own renewables and secure power at half the cost. And if you do the maths on it, 70% of your total cost is power, and you can halve the cost of that by being off grid. It's a no brainer from a cost perspective to be off grid. The second thing, though, about being off grid, and this is a bit more subtle, right, is you can position your sites where the very, very best renewable resource is. What I mean by this is when you look at the renewables landscape today, this industry's been around a while. People have selected sites based on two things. One is, where do I get phenomenal renewables? And then the second is, where do I get a grid connection?
Yeah.
And so, 20 years ago, you were really unconstrained, right? The renewables and the grid connection were kind of really where the renewables were. As more and more people have taken those grid connected sites, if you want a grid connection today, you're looking at a tier 2, a tier 3 type of resource. We can go to wherever and just take phenomenal renewables. We're not constrained by needing a grid. And so that allows us to access better renewables. It allows us to scale. And then there's a whole bunch of compliance requirements that, if you want your fuel to be classified as green, are much easier to meet if you're off grid than on the grid, basically. So a number of reasons why we do this. And then finally, just from a product development perspective, if I haven't convinced you enough that this is a much easier way to proceed, the other thing is, feedstock is everything for these projects. How do you get the cheapest feedstock? And if you are reliant on somebody else to give you that feedstock, you just introduce a whole lot more project on project risk. And so not only do I have to build this first of a kind e-methanol project, find someone to buy the e-methanol, move it over to them, I've now got to go and find a big utility to sell me a huge amount of power and have those discussions around, well, how am I going to provide collateral for that? And it just gets really complicated. So we keep it all in-house, nice and simple, and control our own destiny.
I actually think, Laura, it's genius. And the reason I say that is that from sort of many battle wounds and scars of sort of seeing both delays and opportunity of off grid and on grid, I think it's a genius thing. So I think it's a very clever positioning from you guys. And I'll give you an example. I remember back in 2019, I was at a clean energy thing at Aston Villa, and we had the big electricity power providers and ourselves at the time were doing a liquid fuel that probably in absolute wasn't as green, but it still had very good green transition qualities and was off-grid rather than on-grid solutions. But the difference in time was a 6-month solution versus a 10-year solution, and therefore I actually think what you're talking about makes so much sense, because as you say, the less risk and less you're competing. And then the other thing I've seen is businesses up for sale, those that have got good grid connection, suddenly it's no longer multiples on profit or multiples on customer base or acquisition of client. It's suddenly their grid connection makes that business 3 or 4 times more than what was paid for it, as you say, 15, 20 years ago, when that probably land didn't have that same economic value. And on the flip side, you have businesses where essentially they've really struggled to find modern day values because people are like, well, you're not future proof because you don't have that grid connection. So I think it's a genius move what you've done there, and I really hope that people listening to this understand how clever a move that is. So I think that's very, 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 very cool. Now, ETFuels isn't just in the UK. International Energy Week is international, hence the title. But you guys, I know, are quite passionately involved in the US. It's our second biggest listenership is the US. But we do fully support those people in Germany, Sweden, Australia who are all fighting to overtake the US and listening to us. But I would say that I'm interested of projects in the US. We've obviously had a change in president, and although you guys aren't political, I was just understanding how possibly positively in the future that might help ETFuels and the sort of world we go into in the United States.
Yeah. Well, so we're developing projects in the US, Spain, and Finland. And the reason we chose those locations is really because that's where the best renewables are. And as I mentioned a couple of times, right, the biggest driver of our cost structure is renewables. So we go where the renewables are the best. Um, the US, from a development point of view, like politics is politics. And as you say, things can go this way or that way, but ultimately the renewable resource stays the same. And the other thing we've found about the project development timeline in Texas, which is where we are, is that bringing these projects to market is much easier in Texas than it is in Europe. Now, we started in Europe because we thought that's where the main demand would be for our product, because the regulation that's really incentivizing these early projects to take off is European based. But I think what we found is there's sort of a tension between being close to your customer and then being able to get the fuel to market quickly. And so we've tried to maintain quite a diversified portfolio approach, because ultimately there's going to be pros and cons to both. Regulation is unclear. There's opportunity and challenge in regulation, right? And there could be a whole bunch more subsidies that come to fore in Europe. Things might change in the US, etc. So I think, when I think about what does it take to be successful in project development, it is really about diversification. What the US administration will mean for our projects is we run scenarios all the time, but fundamentally the renewables are still great. Getting to market is quick. And I think, we're trying to maintain a diversified footprint to manage both the risks and the opportunities that may arise.
Can I just ask, how did Finland come about? Because it's fair to say a lot of speakers over the last season have talked about the wonders of Texas, but we don't often hear about Finland. So I was just interested how Finland came about, and the USP of Finland.
Yeah, it's really windy. I mean, that's the bottom line. It's really windy, and there's a lot of biomass to give you CO2 as feedstock. It's simple as we did sort of the. I mean, one of the good things and the bad things. Right? I mean, we were three UK-based founders trying to start an e-fuels business, and we very quickly figured out that the UK was perhaps not the best place, just given a whole bunch of factors for a renewables startup, right? And so we literally did the whole blank sheet of paper exercise and said, where are there good renewables? Where is there biogenic CO2, which we need to make methanol? And where is there water? And where can we get to market quickly? And where can we be near to a customer? And there is no place on the planet where you can achieve all five. But Finland actually ranks pretty high when it comes to power, water, and CO2. Yeah, obviously relatively close to European customers as well. So that was the thinking behind Finland.
But no, a country very dear to my heart. Not always through energy, but I had a very good energy party there at one point. Back in my Shell days, we had an excellent Finnish colleague called Jenny, and she took out 10 of us from Shell and 10 of her friends from Finland to celebrate the summer solstice, and that will always live fondly in my heart. So, like, when you guys have your showcase in Finland and it's around the middle of June, I'm happy to come. We're happy to visit, and
Fantastic. Well,
I give you guys coverage.
I'll bear that in mind. I mean, you're also very welcome to come in the middle of winter.
Fantastic. Get the
It's
Langlauf
yeah,
skis on, and we'll go around the site. Um,
yeah.
I think sort of broadening the international perspective, this is International Energy Week. Obviously, there's a lot of people that are going to be in the QE2 Centre this week with the Energy Institute. There's a lot of meetings also going around the city. There'll be a lot of people raising funds, talking to policymakers. It's one of the most important weeks of the energy year. Obviously, it's awesome that you're a keynote speaker, but what are yourself and ETFuels looking to get out of International Energy Week this year?
I mean, if I'm really brutal, it's always the same. It's customers and money. Can always do with both of those, like any business. I mean, it's obviously it's a great opportunity. I mean, I'm being a bit facetious, but not that facetious. It's a great opportunity to sort of share what we're up to reconnect with other people in the industry. Obviously, a very well attended conference, and so it's a great opportunity to also see what other people are talking about. What's changed and sort of what the mood music is. The hydrogen space in particular has been quite interesting. Ups and downs, and so it's always useful to sort of get a sense of where the market's at and how people are feeling about the outlook for these various regulatory, economic, technology drivers.
Yeah, I mean, hydrogen has had this crazy decade. I remember in like 2017, it was the darling of the industry, and was almost like the sort, not quite dot-com bubble, but it had this like amazing aura to it. And then about 2, 3 years ago, I was in project meetings with hydrogen people of companies that were named nameless, and genuinely, I just wanted to give them a hug. They looked in a like really powerful place, and then suddenly there seems to be a second era again, and obviously there's big projects going in the northeast of England, and big debates over green, blue, other types of hydrogen. But as I say, I think it's going to be fascinating to watch this week because it does seem the biggest emotional roller coaster of any of the industries. But e-fuels, I got to say, feels like the real excited place. I think kind of ever since that you had the likes of F1 talking about e-fuels, you had the likes of Porsche in Patagonia having e-fuels. It does feel that like almost the time and the period is for e-fuels now. Is that a right judgment call for me, do you feel? Or like,
Well, I mean, look, I love the optimism. I mean, look, I would say, I mean, you know, when we started the business, actually one of my co-founders, so the concept actually was derived by my two co-founders, Anthony and Felix. They had spent the last several years modeling out hydrogen transport costs and just getting depressed. And obviously, you know, being paid as consultants to do work by people that wanted to make these projects happen, right? And I think we've always maintained that like there is no hydrogen good, hydrogen bad, right? It's very much around the specific use case and the specific product you're making. And I think one of the things that people have fundamentally underestimated in the hydrogen space is just the challenge of moving hydrogen around, or even some of the derivatives such as ammonia. We've started with very easy to handle, tried and tested methanol because we didn't want to be stuck in that whole waiting for somebody to build a hydrogen pipeline across Europe or dealing with the toxicity around ammonia. We've tried to keep it really simple for a starting position. And I think one of the things that I've actually found frustrating, honestly, with this whole journey has been how much of it is just sentiment driven without people really getting into the understanding of the details of the specific project, the specific use case, and the specific fuel that we're talking about. Hydrogen good, hydrogen bad is not really the point. You know, it's very much around what are you trying to do with that hydrogen and you know what's the business case behind that specific use case. So that's how we think about it anyway.
before we go into our quick fire questions that we like to ask all of our guests, I was just wondering, other than the lucky people that will be in the main hall and can hear from yourself, Lara, this week, how is it best for people to work with ETFuels, stay in contact with the company, and actually, if there's either potential customers or people looking to invest in awesome organisation like this, what's the best way to stay in touch with you guys before we go into our quick fire questions?
Yeah, probably easiest way is to reach out on LinkedIn. We're all on that. Please drop me a line. Very keen to talk.
Obviously, our quickfire questions. We like to say, who's the most relevant person in your contacts books, Lara, that should come on a future Wolfe Power Club podcast?
So I would like to recommend Serena Oppenheim. She is the founder of an organization called Fin Earth, which is a community for women who are leading the climate transition. Obviously, a special place in my heart for such an organization. And quite frankly, I'm going to get off my soapbox around the mess we're in because of all you men. But Serena's amazing and really sees the energy transition from multiple different angles. And I'm sure she'll have lots to share with you around her views on where things are going.
The next question, very important, considering what you're doing. Where are you investing in the energy industry right now?
I'm super long green methanol, Alex. Very, very long green methanol.
So fantastic, long green methanol. Uh, Now, specifically in the next 12 months, I'm not talking about forever, but let's just focus maybe a bit on the British government. I think as you just covered, you cover global stuff, but on the British government, what would you like to see them doing in the next 12 months?
I mean, look, very specific to my space, I think there need to be clear incentives for e-fuels. One of the challenges with decarbonisation is if you don't specify what kind of fuel can be used to meet decarbonisation targets, you create a whole bunch of uncertainty around is it going to be biofuels, is it going to be LNG? Having specific incentives for e-fuels, which is required because e-fuels are the only scalable end state, will get us to that end state much faster.
And our final question, and this is quite an interesting one because I think also any project where you're opening new fuels, to have a customer base that commits to it is very important. So I was just interested, in the next 12 months, what would you like energy customers to do?
I'd like energy customers, particularly that, well, specifically those that have decarbonisation targets or mandates or regulations they have to meet. I'd like them to start thinking about security of supply in a different way to how they've typically purchased fuel. So I'm talking broadly here, but most energy customers are used to buying on short-term contracts. As you start moving into a world where you're looking for green energy and that energy is scarce, you need to be thinking about your procurement risk very differently and taking a much longer term approach, partnership based approach. I'm not talking about giving anyone a free lunch here, but really thinking about locking down that green fuel supply because it is scarce and will be an increasing demand over time, and making longer term commitments upfront to enable your access to that green fuel supply. That then, of course, enables the rest of the value chain to develop, allows the money to flow in, and it becomes a virtuous cycle. It's those long term commitments that really enable the whole thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because I've always felt that if you wanted different techs to really prosper in a society, is ultimately, especially in first world countries, is that governments outside of tax revenues, so many contracts are either directly or indirectly influenced by their buying decision making, and they could make green cities almost very quickly. And I've sometimes seen that, unfortunately, what happens is the procurement person at a local council has to save 10 or 15% on next year's budget, whereas actually they could be the person that switches, whether it's government housing, whether it's government waste trucks, whether it's industry zones. But I've always felt that I sometimes feel they don't realise how much power they do have to potentially create that domino of change. And it always makes me think one day some places will crack it and they will just accelerate so quickly because, as I say, they will say that we will back a supplier, that supplier can bring in the tech, and actually we can set a model of sort of hugely sort of emission load targets because actually we've got infrastructure that's better than anyone else to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic. Well, I think we've got similar values to Finna because on our International Energy Week 6 specials, 70 odd percent are female leaders changing the world. So, and
Fantastic.
as someone with two daughters and who realizes their career is going to be longer than mine, I want to smash that glass ceiling. And it's clear that with today, Lara, you've shown that you've taken multiple industry expertise, whether it's from that background of Rio Tinto, that background from Google, but ultimately clear funding models that don't rely on other people. And I love this idea that with the methanol and the green methanol opportunities you've seen in Finland, you've seen in America, you've seen in other territories, that actually by being off grid, you can make quicker decisions that don't rely on other people. I'd really like to thank your time. I would recommend anyone to go to Lara's session at International Energy Week, but also it feels like it's going to be a very, very exciting 2025 for ETFuels.
Thank you, Alex. It's great to be on the show.